Hi, I'm Wardy from Gnaufkens. In this video, we're going to address the science behind a sourdough starter. This is so you can understand what's really happening in that jar when you're creating a sourdough starter of your own. This topic starts way back at the microscopic level with wild yeasts and bacteria. They are the workers. They rise the sourdough bread foods and prepare them optimally for our digestion. The wild yeasts are single-celled fungi that feed on simple sugars in flour. They need oxygen, and in fact, if oxygen is not given to these yeasts, other organisms which don't need oxygen are encouraged to proliferate instead, such as the yeasts that make beer and wine. And as the yeasts eat the sugars, they give off a small amount of ethanol, which is alcohol, acetic acid, vinegar, and lots of carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide produces the bubbles you see in a sourdough starter, and it also puffs up a rising bread dough. The ethanol and acetic acid lend a sour smell and flavor to dough and bread, and acetic acid also helps keep the bread fresh longer. Now, the bacteria are called Lactobacilli. They eat simple sugars too, but unlike the yeasts, they don't need oxygen. They neutralize phytic acid, and their byproducts are ethanol, lactic acid, and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide helps rise the dough, but the lactobacilli don't give off quite so much as the yeasts, so their work is not so powerful with rising. The ethanol and lactic acid give a distinct sour taste to sourdough bread. And finally, the lactic acid acts as a natural antibiotic, preventing any bad organisms from getting a foothold. Let's contrast modern commercial bread baking practices with traditional sourdough bread. In commercial bread baking, people purchase a laboratory-produced selected strain of yeast. We call it baker's yeast. This yeast isn't so great. First, it must be purchased again and again because it gets used up in the recipes. It has to work quickly or it gets overtaken by wild organisms. Bread made with commercial yeast stales easily. Also, it is pretty picky about its environment in order to work well. For example, the temperature must be just right, and also it can't abide acidity, so you won't ever find this yeast in the presence of lactobacilli, and consequently, bread made with baker's yeast won't offer the neutralization of phytic acid because that job would be performed by the lactobacilli. On the other hand, consider the wild yeasts and accompanying bacteria that produce sourdough bread. They are naturally occurring and when cultivated make a home in a sourdough starter. We, the cooks, keep the starter alive through use and constant feedings. A sourdough starter can last for hundreds of years. It is an ecosystem of wild yeasts and beneficial bacteria that work together to add B vitamins to grains, to break down gluten for better digestion, and to neutralize phytic acid. The sourdough starter's organisms are much more versatile with regard to temperature or other conditions, and the bread doesn't stale as quickly. So I think we can conclude that sourdough bread methods are much to be preferred over modern bread baking methods. All sourdough bread foods begin with a sourdough starter. That's an active colony of wild yeast and lactobacilli suspended in a batter of flour and water. Now, the wild yeast and lactobacilli are everywhere. In the air, in unprocessed whole grain flours, on your fruits and veggies, even on your skin. Unbleached, unprocessed flours in particular have loads of wild yeast and lactobacilli that are perfectly suited for baking, so that's the best place to capture them and nurture them into a mother culture. To make a sourdough starter or a mother culture, take 1/4 cup water and 3/8 cup whole wheat flour, mix vigorously in a glass jar, scrape down the sides, cover the jar loosely, and put the jar in a warm place, somewhere between 65 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. After 12 hours, we would hope to see a few bubbles in the flour-water mixture, showing that some of the organisms fed on the simple sugars, giving off carbon dioxide as a result. The mixture might also begin to smell sour from the ethanol and acids produced. The yeast and bacteria multiplied as well. Initially, the yeast will multiply more than the lactobacilli. And this is all happening at the microscopic level. And there are so many yeasts, we couldn't possibly count them. So let's just pick an easy number to help understand this. Let's say there were 100 wild yeasts at the very beginning. They will multiply at the rate of once every 2 hours in good conditions. So by the end of this first 12 hours, there will be 6,400 wild yeasts in our starter culture. And that's great progress, but it isn't nearly enough organisms for a strong starter culture. So we need to feed our starter a second time to keep the organisms multiplying. We add 1/4 cup water and 3/8 cup whole wheat flour. Mix vigorously, scrape down the sides, cover the mixture, and put it in a warm place for another 12 hours. During this time, the yeast will eat, respirate, and multiply. And at the end of this second 12-hour period, there will be 409,600 of them. But for a strong starter, we do need a higher concentration of yeasts. So we will have to feed the starter again to keep the yeast growing. But if we just add more flour and water right now, we will outgrow our jar. So we have to remove half of this batter and put it in the compost. Now keep in mind, we're not growing a batter, we're growing a starter colony of yeasts. If we just kept feeding the starter without taking any out, within a week it would fill up the house. And that would be much more wasteful than removing a small amount before each feeding. And even though we are discarding some of the organisms with the removed batter each time, the concentration is still increasing exponentially while the volume of the batter is staying constant. And that's what we want. Okay, so we add 1/4 cup of water and 3/8 cup of whole wheat flour, and you know the rest of the routine. Mix vigorously, scrape down the sides, cover loosely, put it in a warm place. We allow another 12-hour period of rest. And after the third 12-hour period, we will have over 13 million organisms in our starter. After the fourth feeding, we will have 832 million organisms. So, can you see now that making a starter is a process of feeding the naturally present organisms and encouraging them to multiply over and over until the jar is full of millions of them? And by the way, even though this example focused on yeasts, the process of growth is similar for the Lactobacilli. However, a good starter will have more yeast than Lactobacilli, and that's necessary to get a good rise. Now, how will you know if your starter is ready to work for you? Well, if for 3 successive feedings the starter doubles or triples in size, filling up the jar with bubbles, then you will know there are plenty of yeast and bacteria eating and respirating. You need to keep the starter at room temperature and feed it twice a day for several weeks, removing half each time. It needs to mature and strengthen. The starter shouldn't be stored in the refrigerator when it is young. And now that the starter is working, you don't have to compost what you remove. You can use the starter for pancakes or other simple recipes.